Number 10. The Wolf Boy. When it comes to children being raised by animals, the most common story you hear is the boy raised by wolves in the forest. And the wolf boy named Ramu is undoubtedly the most famous case of this actually happening. He was originally found in 1976, running through the woods on all fours with a group of wolf cubs who apparently the child had been growing up alongside of. His hair was matted, he had long nails like claws, and he was in very poor health. The local Indian news stations reported he was about 10 years old at the time he was discovered. He had been eating raw meat with his wolf family, and even after he was captured and brought back to society, the boy would sometimes sneak outside and eat raw chickens that he found in the neighborhood. Luckily for him, he was sent to live with Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity, and they patiently taught him how to bathe and wear clothes and act like a relatively normal human. However, the boy never really learned how to speak, and he never really integrated into society. Then, in 1985, the United News of India reported that Ramu the wolf boy had died in his early 20s, while living in a home for the destitute in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is about 250 miles from the capital, New Delhi. It was not clear why he died exactly, but he had apparently developed cramps several weeks prior to his death, and had never been given medical treatment. In this case, the wolf boy did not have a very Disney ending. Number 9. The Wild Girl in France. The Wild Girl of France wasn't raised by animals, but by the wilderness itself. So far as the story goes, the girl was first spotted in 1731 in the Champagne region of France, stealing apples from somebody's tree. She was dressed in rags and carried a club with her. The villagers set their dogs on the girl, but she swiftly beat them off with her club, climbed onto the trees, and then vanished into the forest. It was such a bizarre occurrence that the local nobleman ordered her to be caught, and she was. Only she couldn't really talk. She hissed and screeched at the humans, acting as if she were a wild animal. Sources at the time claimed that she looked to be anywhere between 10 and 18 years old. In 1755, a biographer chronicled the wild girl's story, and what she found was nothing short of fantastic. It turned out that the wild girl had been sold into slavery when she was only 7 years old, and shipped from somewhere near Wisconsin to France. But during that trip, the boat shipwrecked, and she ended up being washed ashore in France, at which point she slunk into the woods and became completely wild. After her capture in 1731, she was baptized and treated at a hospital, where her teeth fell out, and she had a pretty hard time stabilizing. However, she did manage to learn fluent French, and she then became wildly wealthy. A local duke was fascinated by her and gifted her with a generous sum of money, which allowed her to move to Paris. And throughout her long life, she would meet many famous figures, such as Queen Marie, the legendary wife of Louis XV. Number 8. The Monkey Boy. John Sesbanya, a native of Uganda, disappeared into the forest at a young age in the 1980s. He did this after allegedly witnessing his father murder his mother when he was only about 3 years old. Rather than sticking around to deal with the consequences, John ran off into the forest and was then raised by monkeys. The child managed to survive by watching the monkeys and then mimicking their actions. He lived like this, surviving from only the knowledge he gained from the monkeys, till 1991 when he was discovered by a random villager. By then, John was more monkey than man. And even when John became an adult, he still couldn't shed his monkey tendencies. Of course, there were a lot of people who disputed John's story. There will always be doubters, but this is a legit story that actually happened. The villagers who first found John were even scared that he was an evil spirit. And to confirm his story, a BBC documentary crew working with anthropologists put John into a wild group of monkeys to see what would happen. And they found that he could communicate with the monkeys far better than any normal person. Plus, the monkeys immediately behaved as they would with another member of their monkey group. This really solidified the fact that John was definitely raised by the animals, and John actually went on to have a pretty fantastic life. He participated in the Special Olympics in both 1999 and 2003. Do you think you could live in the forest with some monkeys? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 7. Gazelle Boy. The Gazelle Boy has a far more intriguing story than almost any other child raised by animals. Forget about monkeys and wolves. This next boy was literally raised by wild gazelles. He was first discovered in the 1950s by an anthropologist named Jean-Claude Auger as he traveled across the Sahara. There had been rumors in the region about a boy running with the gazelles, but it took roughly a week for the anthropologist to locate him. And when he did, he couldn't believe his eyes. The gazelle boy walked on all fours. He had insanely powerful muscles in his legs, and he behaved just like a gazelle. He even twitched all of his muscles in response to noise, just like a gazelle or deer would. Naturally, the anthropologist captured the gazelle boy, though not before chasing him in his Jeep to see just how fast he could run. The boy was estimated at running about 34 miles per hour, and with the ability to leap about 13 feet through the air. In comparison, most Olympic sprinters can only run at about 27 miles per hour. It looks like if you want to win the Olympics, you better get raised by gazelles. In the end, the gazelle boy allegedly escaped captivity and went back into the wild. However, nobody actually knows if this story is true. Some swear it really happened, and others say it was just an elaborate hoax from the 1950s. Number 6. The boy who lived with dogs. Ivan Mishakov was a young boy living alone on the streets of Moscow in the 1990s. He was what you might call a street urchin. However, he was just a young boy and needed to survive. Ivan soon learned that if he took care of the wild dogs around him, they would take care of him in turn. Ivan was only 4 years old when he integrated himself into the dog pack and began prowling the streets of Moscow like his canine companions. This went on for several years until Ivan was eventually captured by the local authorities. And what happened next will really make you wonder who the real animals are. After Ivan was taken away from his dog family by the authorities, he was brought to an orphanage. The dogs from his pack then began to wait outside the orphanage for Ivan to come out. And guess what the humans did? They rounded them up and killed them. They literally killed Ivan's family. And while this is definitely devastating and tragic, Ivan actually ended up having a pretty normal life. He's still alive today, all over social media, and he has a proper job, a real human family, and is doing extraordinarily well for a boy who started life homeless and literally living with dogs. Number 5. Boy raised by birds. In another shocking story straight out of Russia, there was once a boy who had been treated like a pet bird by his mother and ended up being raised essentially by the other birds in the house. He was rescued by Russian care workers at the age of 7 and could only communicate by chirping like a bird. The child was found inside of a small apartment filled mostly with bird cages and covered in bird food and bird poop. His mother had apparently never spoken human words to him in all of his life, and so his only way of communicating had been by mimicking the birds in the apartment. When he was spoken to by a human, all he did was chirp back. This is definitely one of the stranger cases of child abuse because the boy's mother never beat him or did anything inherently cruel. She just never spoke to him, so his language became that of the birds. The boy was temporarily transferred to an asylum after being rescued, and then he was taken to a psychological care center. According to the Daily Mail, his mother willingly signed an abdication releasing him into the government's care, and hopefully this boy will be able to learn how to properly talk so he can grow up to be able to be a functional member of society. Number 4. The leopard boy. It seems unbelievable, but there was apparently a young boy from a small village in India who'd been stolen by a leopard at the young age of only 2. It happened while his mother was out in the fields cutting rice. The villagers had apparently killed 2 of the leopard's cubs in the previous days, and the mother had been lurking along the outskirts of the village ever since. The leopard allegedly took the boy, brought him into the jungle, and instead of eating him, raised him as her own cub for 5 long years. When the boy was finally discovered, it was by hunters outside of the village. They killed the mama leopard and found the young boy hiding with 2 other leopard cubs. During those few years he had lived with the leopards, the boy had developed a very keen sense of smell. His toes had turned upright to help him run, and the palms of his hands had become calloused with extremely tough skin. He was pretty feral. The boy would fight and bite any person who got too close to him, and when he spotted something like a wild fowl, he would run at it and tear it to pieces. The boy had been so dramatically altered that he wouldn't even sleep in his own bed when he was returned to his human family's house. His father had to tie him to a post in the yard and let him sleep outside. In the end, the leopard boy apparently made a fairly normal recovery. Number 3. Children of wolves. In the 1920s, 2 girls named Amala and Kamala were found being raised by a she-wolf in the wilds of India. They were first spotted by a local villager who thought it was strange that 2 of the wolf's cubs looked an awful lot like humans. It turned out they were humans, and they were quickly seized by the villagers and then taken to an orphanage. Both of the young girls appeared wolfish. They were extremely fond of raw meat, and they slurped their liquids with their tongues rather than drinking like ordinary humans. Their tongues even hung out of their mouths just like wolves. Unfortunately, the youngest girl died shortly after being brought to the orphanage, and her sister Kamala was left alone with the workers at the orphanage. As hard as they tried, it was difficult getting Kamala to speak properly or even act like a human. They did make very slow progress, but it was clear that living in the wild as a child had essentially ruined her brain. She simply couldn't become human again. It was never found out who left the two girls in the wild in the first place, and unfortunately, Kamala then passed away in 1929, less than 10 years after she was rescued. Number 2. Wild Peter. In 1725, Wild Peter was found alone, naked, and completely barbarian in a German forest. He was likely left behind by his parents who probably didn't have the means to care for him. But it turned out okay for Peter, who managed to care for himself pretty well. To this day, Wild Peter is one of the most confusing stories of feral children, and also one of the most inhumane. You see, after Peter was rescued from the forest, he was brought to London, where he became a human pet at the famous Kensington Palace. Everybody assumed the boy had been raised by either wolves or bears, seeing as he hobbled around on all fours. He couldn't talk, and nobody seemed able to teach him English. He wouldn't even sleep in a bed. Instead, Peter preferred to curl up on the floor and go to sleep in the corner. But here's where things got really grotesque. The fancy folks at Kensington Palace grew tired of Peter, and so they donated him to a farm. This guy was literally treated like an animal. The farm that he went to even had a collar made for him in case he got lost. And according to the BBC, you can still see Peter's headstone in Hertfordshire today. Number 1. The girl raised by monkeys. A crew of lumberjacks working in a secluded area of India made the discovery of a lifetime when they stumbled upon a young girl walking on all fours and screeching at them as if she were a monkey. The woodsmen quickly alerted government officials of what they had seen, and 2 months later she was discovered again by the proper authorities living near to the Nepalese border. It turned out that the young girl had been raised by a troop of monkeys. She was found mostly naked, completely unable to talk to humans, and she had wounds all over her legs and elbows. According to the authorities at the time, she had been living comfortably with the animals. She was also completely terrified of the humans who found her. She couldn't speak or even hear properly. She was being guarded by actual monkeys, and she appeared weakened and very hungry. According to her rescuers, if they hadn't got there in time, the young girl could have easily been eaten by other animals. Her rescuers gave her some food to eat and took her out of the jungle. It wasn't clear what age she'd been abandoned, but it was early enough for her to become more of a monkey than a human. Even after being brought back to civilization and checked into a hospital, she had trouble adjusting to her new life. Even the chief medical officer of the hospital said she was behaving just like a monkey. Ever since the story was first published, the girl has been making small steps towards transitioning back into being a human. Hopefully, by the time she's an adult, she can live a normal life. Aleister Crowley referred to himself as the Great Beast 666. He's been labeled one of the most wicked and most controversial occultists who has ever lived. He wrote insane scriptures. He founded his own perverse religious order. And he even designed tarot cards that are still in use today. Aleister Crowley was born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875. In his early years, he became captivated by the erotic and the esoteric. He once published a piece of poetry that one critic described as the most disgusting piece of erotica in the English language. He became involved with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but evolved far beyond them. His philosophy was that every single person should follow the pursuit of their own will, with no regard for laws, ethics, or even popular opinion. Aleister Crowley eventually became involved in what can only be described as satanic rituals. He experimented with both sex and drugs, and was even involved in a mysterious death in 1923 when one of his followers died after drinking the blood of a cat during one of his rituals. Aleister Crowley was at one point expelled from Italy. He was a heroin addict for a while, and he fathered many illegitimate children. And then he eventually died in 1947 after publishing plenty of perverse and disgusting works, many of which are still around today. And while Crowley himself wasn't that dangerous physically, his words and beliefs were dangerous to all those who took stock in them, even now. Number 9. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, sometimes known as the Beast of Chicago, is often considered to be the first American serial killer. He was born on May 16, 1861, into a wealthy family. But wealth didn't make him a good person. He became a con artist and a bigamist. It's believed that Holmes murdered anywhere between 20 and 200 people, with the bulk of his victims being murdered inside of a specially constructed home just for that purpose. His home was eventually nicknamed the Murder Castle, and Holmes was caught in 1894 and hanged 2 years later for his crimes. Holmes was one of the most dangerous men in history. He had an unusual intelligence, he had a strange interest in medicine, and he apparently practiced surgery on animals as a young child. He would even steal corpses when he was attending the University of Michigan, and he'd experiment on those. He worked as a pharmacist and allegedly killed the owner of the pharmacy where he worked and took over his business. Inside Holmes's murder house, there were 3 floors of horrors. He designed the house with dozens of small rooms in which he could torture and kill his victims. He even had trapdoors installed in his house so he could move the bodies to the basement undetected, where he would then burn them or dispose of them in other ways. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie The House of a Thousand Corpses, it may as well have been based on Howard Holmes's house. According to biography.com, he opened his home up as a hotel in 1893 and killed many of his guests before being caught. Number 8. Rasputin. Most of Rasputin's life is shrouded in mystery. He's often referred to as the mad monk who steered Russia into an era of chaos. He's also been described as a sorcerer, and is without a doubt one of the most fearsome characters in Russia's long and dark history. Rasputin started his career as a faith healer and eventually managed to get himself into the court of Tsar Nicholas II. After helping to cure Tsarina Alexandra Fedorovna's son, he became the closest advisor to the Tsarina by 1911, and then the madman began using his influence to do all kinds of horrendous things. One of the most bizarre things Rasputin was reported doing was forcing women of high society to lick his dirty fingers after he dipped them in a bowl of soup. He was accused of many sexual crimes and apparently consorted with prostitutes in the night. By 1916, Russians were terrified of Rasputin. He had earned himself a reputation for being an inhumane monster, and a group of aristocrats ended up poisoning him that same year with cyanide. But the cyanide didn't work. The murderers had to shoot him repeatedly and then beat him before he finally stopped breathing, at which point they dumped his body into a river. But even though Rasputin was dead, he had already greatly disgraced the royal family. And just 2 years later in 1918, the Tsar and the Tsarina and all their children were murdered during a revolution. Have you heard of this Rasputin? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 7. Thomas de Torquemada. Thomas de Torquemada was the first Grand Inquisitor in Spain, who presided over the entire Spanish Inquisition between 1483 and 1498. When you imagine all the horrible things that were done during the Spanish Inquisition, you should think of this man. He was a notorious villain who started out as a Franciscan monk and worked his way up until he could reorganize the Inquisition to his liking and expand it to include crimes of blasphemy and sorcery. He was in charge of the most brutal Catholic tribunal in history, trying to erase heretics and non-believers from the face of the earth. Of course, most confessions of heresy came from painful torture, including strangulation and being stretched on a rack. There was waterboarding, hangings, and a whole lot of blood in a whole lot of dungeons. But Thomas was hardly just a torturer. He was responsible for ordering the expulsion of Jews, Muslims, and people of color out of Spain, claiming that they threatened to taint the spiritual purity of the country. By the end of his days as Grand Inquisitor, about 2,000 people had been beheaded or burned at the stake. Number 6. The Monster of the Andes. The Monster of the Andes, who goes by the name Pedro Lopez, took more lives than any serial killer in the United States. He was convicted in Colombia for murdering more than 300 people. His story is one of violence and mayhem. He was an extremely dangerous man who spent much of his early life homeless, entrenched in violence, and in and out of incarceration. As an adult, Pedro embarked on a spree of terror and murder in which he targeted mostly young girls throughout the 1970s. He committed these murders in Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, and was apprehended for the first time in Peru for trying to kidnap a 9-year-old girl. The community in which he was captured tried to bury him alive as punishment, but a Western missionary convinced the villagers to turn him over to the police. And that was a mistake. The murders kept going and going. And finally, several years later in 1980 in Ecuador, he was caught again and charged with 111 killings. and then shipped back to Colombia. However, he only served 14 years, and after being set free for serving the time, he vanished. Today, his whereabouts are still unknown. This guy literally murdered 300 young girls in the most violent and horrific way imaginable, and then he was let out of prison. Nobody knows where he is, and there are concerns that he's connected to at least one murder from 2002, but there could be a lot more. Number 5. Pol Pot. Pol Pot is one of the sickest dictators in the world, and he was responsible for the deaths of up to 2 million of his own countrymen. Everyone is familiar with Stalin and Mao and Hitler, but not many people know who Pol Pot is, even though he was one of the most dangerous and brutal men to have ever lived. He was the communist leader of the Khmer Rouge and took over Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. According to History.com, anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians perished during that time, either from starvation, exhaustion, disease, or murder. In one of the most notorious prison camps ever constructed by Pol Pot and his regime, it's been estimated that only 7 out of 20,000 people imprisoned there survived. And here's why Pol Pot was so dangerous. He wanted to engineer a communist society without class, meaning everyone would be the same. In order to do this, he rallied the farmers and low-class people of the country and banded them together against the intellectuals who lived in cities, those who ruled religions, and so on and so forth. The result was that anyone who looked intelligent, who wore glasses, who practiced art, who lived in a big city, or who even had soft hands was murdered. But not just murdered, exterminated. Pol Pot decreed that all those who were to be killed also had their families killed. This resulted in one of the most barbaric regimes in human history, and it happened less than 50 years ago. Number 4. Nero. Julius Caesar may well be the most well-known Roman emperor in popular culture, but Nero Claudius Caesar was by far the most dangerous. Nero ruled Rome between 54 AD and 68 AD, and he's known for his perverse lifestyle, his string of political murders, and his violent persecution of Christians. He famously killed his rivals and even killed his own wife by kicking her in the belly in what one Roman historian referred to as a casual outburst of rage. Nero killed his younger stepbrother so that he couldn't take the throne from him, and there are some rumors that say he even killed his own mother. Basically, he murdered anyone he didn't like. And when Rome caught fire in 64 AD, Nero stood on the roof of his palace and watched the city burn while he apparently played loud music and had a very good time. All in all, Nero's reign was brief, violent, and spelled the end of the Roman Caesars. Number 3. Leopold II of Belgium. When it comes to leaders who did their fair share of killing, Leopold II of Belgium was the most murderous of all. If you've never heard of this guy, don't worry, he's literally nowhere in popular culture, but he did rule Belgium from 1865 to 1909, and his statues have been the source of a lot of controversy in Brussels. He was definitely the leader of the nation, but he was also a violent king who allegedly killed 10 million Africans. In recent time, the statues of Leopold II have been vandalized, caught on fire, and heavily protested. The reason is that in 1885, Leopold II seized a massive piece of Africa in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he seized it all for himself. The following years of his rule were so bloody that it was even condemned by other European colonists in the early 1900s. He claimed to want to create a civilization in Africa from his own mind, and had promised that the mission in Africa would be humanitarian. Instead, Leopold II forced the locals into slave labor so he could sell off the rubber, the ivory, and the minerals from the region. There were kidnappings of children to work or be trained as soldiers. Famine and disease spread quickly, and a total of about 10 million people died during this time, though that number is not 100% confirmed. And perhaps one of the most sickening aspects is that Leopold II never even stepped foot in the Congo. But he did build his own African museum inside of his palace in which he held a human zoo with 267 Congolese people exhibited for the curious high society to come and take a gander at. His rule in Africa came to a swift end in 1908 when other European leaders forced him to relinquish control, and then he died the following year. Number 2. The Monster Killer. Yang Xinhai is known as the Monster Killer of China. This guy was born in 1968 in the Henan province and would grow up to be one of the cruelest and most dangerous men in Chinese history. He ran away from home at 17. He traveled around the country working as a laborer, and he committed some minor crimes. Then, around the year 1999, he went on a 3-year killing spree, in which he massacred entire families of farmers, including children and adults. One man even came home to find his entire family bludgeoned to death, all at the hands of Yang Xinhai. He often used sharp objects he found inside of victims' homes, such as meat cleavers and shovels, to commit these murders. And at the end of this monster's killing spree, he had butchered roughly 67 people across 4 different provinces. He was finally apprehended in November of 2003, and he confessed to every single crime he had ever committed. And he claimed that his reason for murdering all these innocent people was that he didn't much care for society, and killing was just something he enjoyed doing. Number 1. Heinrich Himmler. Everyone is familiar with Adolf Hitler. He was a pretty bad guy, to say the least, but almost nobody ever talks about Heinrich Himmler, the true architect of terror in the Nazi regime. When it comes to the person who actually used their hands to implement the final solution, nobody is more guilty than Heinrich Himmler. He joined the Nazi Party in August of 1923 and even helped to boost Hitler's reputation after the soon-to-be dictator landed himself in prison in November of that same year. Himmler was responsible for developing the elite faction of the Nazi Party known as the SS. He boosted their numbers from 280 to 52,000 men. And even though everyone thinks Hitler is responsible for pretty much everything that happened in Germany during World War II, and yes, in a way he is, Himmler actually had total control over deciding who was German and who wasn't, where Germans were allowed to live, and which populations were to be destroyed to make room for the Germans. Without getting into some seriously disturbing history, Himmler ultimately established mobile killing units and initiated the mass murder of Jews, the Roma people, homosexuals, and anyone with disabilities. It was Himmler who implemented the Nazi concentration camp system, with the first of its kind being established in an abandoned munitions factory by Himmler himself. Under the direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, roughly 2.7 million people were killed inside of these camps, either by asphyxiation or toxic gas or by shooting. The last place anyone expects to find a Burmese python is lounging on their boat, and yet that's exactly what happened in Coral Gables, Florida, when professional wranglers were called in to deal with an aquatic invader. The owners of the boat had gotten the shock of a lifetime when they found the massive serpent skulking around in the upper deck of their boat, which at the time was parked in their dock in Miami. It's not really clear how the snake got into the boat in the first place, but it ended up being over 8 feet long. And while nobody was injured, somebody definitely could have gotten hurt had the snake surprised them with a bite to the face. It could have been someone's pet that got loose, or it could have swum into the boat from somewhere else in Florida. Florida is, after all, a place with a lot of aggressive aquatic or reptilian wildlife. In any case, the snake wranglers got rid of the snake and the people were let back onto their boat safely. Number 9. The 100-foot snake. In more shocking news, a snake estimated to be around 100 feet long was allegedly spotted swimming up a river in Borneo. The Daily Telegraph originally reported the sighting of the monster snake, prompting locals to be very concerned. After all, there are lots of legends in the area of giant snakes hiding in the jungle, larger than mythical dragons and very capable of devouring a human. The photographs of the monster were apparently taken from a helicopter flying above the Ballet River, and some locals claimed it was a creature from folklore known as the Naboo, a shape-shifting serpent. However, this probably wasn't the case. Live Science reported that the photograph was likely doctored and the snake wasn't real at all. And this makes sense considering the largest snake fossils ever found were of a creature only 43 feet in length, the legendary and long since extinct Titanoboa. Finding a 100-foot snake in nature in this day and age would be like witnessing a T-Rex stomping through San Francisco or a Godzilla-type monster descending on Tokyo. It's just not a thing that's probably ever going to happen. But have you ever seen a large snake in the wild? Let me know about it in the comments below. Number 8. Albino snake thieves. A couple in the United States recently slithered out of a pet store with a rare albino snake worth over $300. The couple were being hunted by police in Peabody, Massachusetts after their brazen robbery in broad daylight. It happened at a Petco store, according to the Salem News. One of the thieves asked an employee if he could play with the expensive albino cinnamon ball python. The employee answered that playing with the snake was against store policy and the thief offered to buy it. The employee put the snake inside of a box and brought it to the register. And the second the employee put the snake on the counter, the man grabbed it and he and his lady friend ran out of the store, got in their car, and sped away as if they had just robbed a bank. This is obviously pretty horrible. There's been no news as to whether the couple have been captured or not. And as for the rarity of the snake, albino snakes are actually incredibly valuable. This is because their skin has absolutely no color. It's a rare genetic condition that can happen in any animal, really, causing it to be an albino. Nobody knows what the couple were planning to do with the snake when they stole it, but hopefully they're at least taking good care of it before they get hauled off to jail. So why do you think they would steal that snake? The whole situation is pretty bizarre regardless, don't you think? It just doesn't make a ton of sense. What do you think should happen to them? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe to World List if you haven't already for more videos like this one. Number 7. The Toddler and the Snake. A toddler was recently filmed playing with a giant snake that could have easily swallowed him in one gulp. This is one of the craziest videos to hit the internet lately. The toddler looked to be no more than 3 years old, and he could clearly be seen riding on the back of a python that was at least 15 feet long. Even more disturbing is that the parents were allegedly the ones filming their kid wrestling with the monster snake. Throughout the entire video, the child can be seen tormenting, teasing, and basically bullying this snake. And yet the snake never bites him. How could such a wild animal be so well trained? Snakes aren't domesticated like dogs and cats. They'll always be a threat to humans, especially babies who are bullying them. Perhaps the only saving grace was that the snake appeared to have already eaten. It had a huge bulge in its stomach, so maybe it just wasn't hungry. Maybe it had already eaten another toddler. If it had indeed been hungry, such a powerful snake could have easily crushed the boy with its muscles and then eaten him for dinner. Nobody knows exactly where the video was taken, but it's safe to say someone should definitely be getting child services involved. Number 6. Attack of the Villagers. Residents in Benito Juarez, Mexico recently battled what can only be described as a dangerous and gigantic snake. The snake was about 25 feet long, and it ended up being beaten to death by Mexican villagers after they feared that the snake was too big and could swallow a child. The snake was first spotted alongside a railway track in a remote part of the Mexican state of Tabasco. The snake was spotted by passengers on the train as they rolled into town, and they quickly gathered up their sticks and converged on the snake to beat it to death. Somebody even chopped this thing's head off with a machete. And of course, conservationists have denounced the behavior, but the villagers feel they did the right thing, as they needed to protect their livestock and their children against the behemoth of a snake, as it could have very easily swallowed a young boy or girl playing outside and then slithered off into the bushes. It's always a sad day when an animal perishes because it's presenting a risk to humans who live near it. With better conservation efforts, hopefully we can avoid this kind of incident in the future. Number 5. Snake in a Trap. A video has recently surfaced online showing a monster anaconda stuck inside of some kind of trap. Apparently, villagers have been trying to capture the thief that had been stealing their chickens. The thief turned out to be one of the biggest snakes ever spotted in the area. It looked to be possibly over 10 feet in length, and it ended up getting stuck inside of a muddy lake after sticking its head inside of a blue pipe placed there by the villagers. The villagers had set up a chicken as live bait to catch the poultry thief, and it worked. The massive anaconda was caught, though nobody knows what the villagers did with it, and chances are they cooked that snake up as a free meal. Number 4. Snakes on fire. One of the biggest snakes ever seen by human eyes was recently discovered in Indonesia, but it was in some pretty rough shape when it was found. After a wave of devastating wildfires back in 2019, people were shocked to discover the remains of animals that had been unable to escape the raging infernos. Among these charred animal remains were the burnt leftovers of snakes, with one reported to be over 30 feet long. The snakes appeared to have been burnt alive, some of them left with their mouths open, almost as if they had been screaming in pain as they were roasted. This is obviously horrific, just like the wildfires in Australia that recently killed off thousands of koala bears. In this case, the sheer size of the cooked snakes has left experts scratching their heads. The snakes were mostly pythons, which as everyone knows can grow to be insanely large, but apparently some of the biggest ones went completely undetected, living in the Indonesian jungle. The biggest snake was estimated to be approximately 32 feet in length and able to eat an entire cow in one bite. Number 3. Escape from the Bronx. Back in 2011, an extremely venomous snake escaped from the Bronx Zoo, and both alarmed and terrified people living in New York. Somehow, an Egyptian cobra managed to slither out of its enclosure and get lost for 6 whole days. The last thing New York needs are cobras riding the subway and slipping into apartment buildings. It would have been a huge disaster. But luckily, the Egyptian cobra was eventually found not too far from where it had originally escaped. According to ABC News, the cobra was discovered coiled into a ball only a short distance away from the enclosure it had snuck out of. A reptile house employee then captured the animal using special snake tongs and put it back in its house. In the end, everybody was safe and sound, but this could have been much, much worse. Egyptian cobras are so venomous that a single bite can kill a human. And this is even truer for a child. If a zoo visitor had gotten bit by the Egyptian cobra during its lengthy escape, the Bronx Zoo would have been in some serious trouble. Number 2. Snake for supper. A security guard in Indonesia working at a palm oil plantation recently got into a literal fight with a giant python. According to the report from the BBC, the python attacked the man after he tried to move it out of the way because local people couldn't cross the road. This beast was about 26 feet long and more than capable of squeezing a man's bones until they cracked and shattered. But this proved to be one tough security guard. With the help of a few villagers who were alerted to the situation, he was able to beat the snake off and kill it, though he didn't walk away unscathed. The man did suffer serious injuries that he needed to be treated for. The snake had nearly ripped the security guard's left arm clean off with its fangs. And what do you think happened to that snake after it lost the fight? Well, the villagers tied it up and put it on display and then fried it and ate it. And believe it or not, snake meat apparently tastes just like chicken, according to the villagers. I mean, I probably wouldn't eat it, but maybe some adventurous foodies out there would. Would you? Let me know in the comments. Number 1. Snake in the toilet. A college student recently got a very nasty surprise when she walked into her bathroom and discovered a python over 13 feet long slithering across her toilet. She panicked and ran out of the room and called 911. The police and wildlife officials arrived to take care of the snake, but it was actually so big that they had a tough time catching it. The police had to use an outside trash can to hold the snake inside until the proper equipment showed up. It turned out that the snake was an African rock python, one of the biggest snakes on the planet. The college student told local news that it probably slithered into her house through an open window. After the snake was captured, an ad was posted online by the Humane Society saying that they had found this rude serpent. The owner of the snake saw the ad and replied saying that his African rock python had been missing for 2 months. Apparently, the confused snake was just trying to find its way back home. $43 million were recently discovered by the Nigerian Anti-Corruption Unit in an upscale apartment in the Nigerian capital of Lagos. There have been a lot of funny accusations circulating online saying that the money had belonged to some Nigerian prince who had been trying to give it away over the phone and through emails, but nobody has been taking the free money. Of course, this is a joke about the spam emails people used to receive in which someone from Nigeria would offer them free cash with no strings. However, this $43 million was not being given away by anyone and was instead the product of corruption and looted funds, most likely by government officials, though no arrests have been made. Nigeria has been struggling with quite a bit of corruption lately, and this particular incident saw huge amounts of dollar bills hidden neatly inside cabinets underneath wood panels inside a bedroom wardrobe. The seizures were credited to a new policy in which whistleblowers can provide information anonymously through a secure portal. If the information they give up leads to the recovery of stolen public funds, the whistleblower is entitled to a small percentage of the recovered money. Maybe someone figured, hey, might as well come clean and get a little piece of that pot instead of going to jail. Nobody knows exactly where the money came from or where it's going next, but hopefully the seizure of money helps to eliminate the rampant corruption in the country. Number 10. Money in the heels. Over $150,000 in cash was recently discovered by customs officials at an airport in Colombia after a Dutch woman arrived from Europe acting rather suspiciously. The money was found hidden inside of her heels. The money had been folded into extremely tight bundles and then fashioned inside 4 wedge heels in her suitcase. She also had a huge stack of cash inside of her purse. Each package inside her high-heeled shoes contained a bundle of 45,000 euros, which altogether equaled over $150,000. The operation was apparently carried out by immigration professionals to prevent money laundering in Colombia. There weren't any details about who the woman was working for or what happened after she was arrested, But it really makes you wonder just how suspiciously this woman must have been acting for the airport officials to rip apart her shoes. Maybe next time she's smuggling cash into a country, she'll act cool while going through airport security. Number 9. Couch money. Have you ever found loose change in your sofa? It's a fairly normal find, but what about finding tens of thousands of dollars in your couch? A man from Michigan named Howard Kirby bought a used couch from the store for just $35. And what he didn't expect to find was an extra $43,000 hidden in one of the cushions. He was quite shocked upon discovering the wad of cash and decided to do the Good Samaritan thing and report it to the store's manager. After all, he was just looking for a place to sit and watch TV. Kirby was able to find the original owner through store records, and when he called the family, he told them, "I found something you're going to want back." It turned out that the couch had belonged to the family's grandfather that had passed away just the year before. When they went to pick up the sofa, they thought the big find was going to be some old family pictures. So I'm sure they were quite happy to discover the cash instead. Number 8. Cash in the ceiling. When a homeowner decided he was going to remodel his basement, he never imagined he would discover what he did. It was a small metal box tucked inside of the ceiling, wedged between a metal air duct and a wooden beam. He found the box after ripping the ceiling apart, and it appeared to be very old. It had been tied shut with a shoelace and abandoned. Inside the box were old newspaper clippings from the 1950s, with one of the papers dating back to March 25, 1951. The newspaper wasn't the only thing stashed away in the box, though. The homeowner also discovered 3 bundles of cash wrapped in wax paper. Each bundle contained a few $1,000s in $20 bills from the 1950s. In the end, this guy ended up walking away with over $15,000 and a collection of rare bills, with some of the oldest dating back to 1928. He had no idea who left the box inside the house, but it did prove to make him a much wealthier man. And then, if you can believe it, the homeowner returned to his renovations and found yet another box, this one with $45,000 in bills stacked away. At this point, I'd probably start tearing down all the walls. I mean, if you were contemplating starting renovations in your basement, this should be a pretty good motivation to get on it right away. You never know what's going to be stashed secretly inside of your ceiling. Do you have any theories on why this money was stashed in the ceiling or who could have put it there? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, go ahead and give this video a like and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 7. Stinkin' Thinkin'. A Florida man has recently become the butt of jokes all across the internet after being charged with stuffing $1,000 in cash into his butt. Patrian Stokes was apparently trying to hide the cash from the cops, and he thought it would be a good idea to wedge all that money into the one spot he assumed they wouldn't look. This happened after he was pulled over by the authorities for speeding. The cops smelled marijuana from inside of the car and decided to carry out a search, at which point they found a whole lot of other illegal drugs, including cocaine and heroin. To try and keep his money from falling into the hands of the police, Stokes tried to wedge as much cash as he could up his rectum. But unfortunately for this stinky criminal, he didn't get away with it. According to the New York Daily News, the police saw $20 bills sticking out from his backside and they figured out exactly what he'd done. He was then charged with an extra crime of trying to smuggle contraband into a detention facility. Number 6. A $7,000 meal. In yet another strange story of cash being found where it doesn't belong, doctors recently had to remove 57 $100 bills from a Colombian woman's stomach and intestines after she tried to swallow $7,000 in cash to hide it from her husband. So far as the story goes, the woman desperately wanted to keep the cash away from her husband during a fight that they were having. So she swallowed the $100 bills in tight rolls, thinking she could retrieve the money later. But as you can imagine, this wasn't the greatest idea in human history. Far from it. The bills could have caused some serious damage if she hadn't gone to the hospital and gotten the surgery done. According to the director of surgery at the University Hospital of Santander, the woman had some of the bills pass through her colon, but they were forced to surgically remove the rest of them through her stomach. And if you're wondering why she was so desperate to hide the money from her husband, apparently she'd been saving her money to go on vacation and was afraid that her husband would steal it from her. Sounds like it might be time to part ways if you have to go through so much trouble. Also, I wonder if she had to use the money retrieved to pay for the surgery. What do you think? Number 5. The bra and girdle. In April of 2014, a Florida woman was just caught carrying roughly $40,000 through customs. She was discovered with the cash hidden in a completely ridiculous place, too. 78-year-old Victoria Farron and her daughter were stopped trying to board a flight to the Philippines from the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. Strangely, it had been the elderly woman who was trying to smuggle the cash through the security at the airport. Customs officials got suspicious and asked to search the old woman's belongings, at which point they discovered $8,000 stashed away in different wallets. The customs officers were really suspicious now, and a search revealed that Victoria had thousands of dollars stashed inside of her blouse, sewn into the straps of her bra, and hidden inside of her girdle. By the time the search was finally over, $40,977 was discovered inside of her various garments. When asked why she had so much money stashed on her person, she told customs officers that she thought it would be safer to carry it herself rather than send it to the Philippines via wire transfer. And even though no charges were placed, ABC News reported that she had her money taken away regardless, as it was apparently labeled as currency forfeitable to the United States, whatever that means exactly. Number 4. Money in the TV. A man in Ontario working at a recycling plant recently cracked open the wooden frame of a broken television set from the 80s and to his amazement found $100,000 in Canadian currency hiding inside. The television had apparently been sent to the scrap heap the year before, and its owner didn't even realize that he'd forgotten about $100,000 he'd stashed inside the TV many years earlier. Rather than stuffing the money into his pockets, the worker at the recycling plant informed the authorities of what he'd found. Police were then able to reunite all the lost cash with a man in his late 60s living in a small village of only about 400 people. They were able to do this by tracing banking records from 1985. But what's really crazy is that even when the police arrived at the man's house to inform him that they had his money, he hadn't even known it was missing. The senior had tucked all that cash into an old TV as a secret hiding spot and then forgot all about it. And then just recently, either himself or one of his family members had probably thrown the TV into the trash without knowing it was full of money. In the end, the old miser got his money back and everyone was happy. That was a really nice guy to return that money. Would you have done that? Number 3. The bad cop. While searching a criminal suspect's house in Abbotsford, British Columbia, a police officer was recently accused of stuffing cash into his sock. This is obviously not something that a police officer is supposed to do, and yet he very well could be guilty. The officer had been part of an investigation in which the home of a drug dealer was searched, including storage lockers and a collection of vehicles. About $46,000 was seized, and it was revealed during the trial that there had been hidden cameras inside one of the bedrooms. These very hidden cameras captured what appeared to be a police officer stuffing cash into his socks. This is the one place cash is not supposed to be found, inside a cop's socks. However, the officer was never charged with any kind of crime. He testified in court that he simply put the money in his sock as part of a joke. Number 2. A buried treasure. Matthew and Maria Colonna Manuel had lived on their property for many years and never really paid attention to the rusty metal object sticking out behind some trees in their property. They always assumed it was just a leftover piece of a cable car or maybe an electrical box. It wasn't until years after moving into their property on Staten Island that the couple finally decided to dig up the strange metal object. What they discovered was a safe with $52,000 in cash, along with a heap of gold and diamonds. What a jackpot! But the couple also found a piece of paper with an address that happened to belong to one of their neighbors. And being the good people that they are, they went to this neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and asked if they had ever been robbed. Apparently, they had been robbed. In fact, they'd been burgled the day after Christmas in 2011, and the thieves had gotten away with a safe filled with about $52,000. So apparently, the thieves hadn't really gotten very far. They must have dumped the safe by accident in the trees of Matthew and Maria's yard, and then somehow forgotten all about it. Matthew and Maria gave the safe back to their neighbors, who were obviously pretty happy to have all that money back. Matthew said their neighbor started to shake when he told her they'd found her safe on their property. And when asked why they didn't keep all that loot for themselves, Maria said it wasn't even a question, it just wasn't ours. And Matthew added, "The reward is karma, good karma." What a lovely sounding couple. Number 1. The richest dog. A man in Tennessee loved his dog so much that he went beyond normal measures and wrote his dog into his will, leaving this canine $5 million. You expect to find money in someone's will, but you don't expect it to be going to a dog. When Bill Doris died, he left a huge portion of his fortune to his border collie named Lulu. But of course, Lulu wasn't given the $5 million in cash. The dog isn't trotting around with a giant briefcase of money, sorry to disappoint. Instead, the dog was transferred to an official caretaker, and all costs associated with caring for the dog will be reimbursed through the $5 million fund. According to the report in People magazine, Lulu's new owner is looking forward to caring for her new friend and seeing just how close the two of them can get to spending the entire fortune. Of course, only on dog-related things. Thanks for watching. What's the weirdest place you've ever found money? Let me know in the comments and be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.